Hello, hello. Welcome to my official second Let's Play that I've ever done. I know that at the end of the Let's Play of Phantasmagoria 1, I very excitedly said that I was looking forward to jumping into Phantasmagoria 2. However, I gave that game a try, and unfortunately, I couldn't really get past some of the issues that I found with the plot. The main character, um, as soon as he left his house and got to work, um, started experiencing all these paranormal situations, and as a result, it was hard to take seriously, like the extent to which his life just immediately changed, and the amount of things that were happening to him that would cause him to anyone to really go crazy and sort of run out of the workplace screaming, but instead he kept going and experiencing all these things. So I didn't get very far with Phantasmagoria 2. So, yeah, there was a lot of problems with that. One I know is in particular is that it was very, very obvious from the beginning that there was some hidden evil thing that would be discovered later on one of the floors of the office building where the main character works, because there kept being reference to some sort of chemicals in some sort of in this floor where you weren't allowed to go. And I didn't even get very far. I didn't even get very far into the plot, and I could already sort of tell what was going to happen in a vague sense. So I dropped that pretty quick, and I don't think I'll spend any time trying to get back into Phantasmagoria 2. But I guess there is an aspect of Let's Plays that sort of makes you want to keep going and really enjoy and get into the plot of a game, no matter if it's a little formulaic and cheesy. I think there's a very good chance that I wouldn't have been at all into Phantasmagoria 1 had I not made it part of a Let's Play. So, onto this. What is this? This is a real-time strategy game with significant RPG elements that make it very, very unique and interesting. And it really is one of my favorite games. It really has an entrancing art style to it that's like no other, and it really draws you into this mysterious world of, this wooded forested land, rolling hills, and ancient ruined temples. Really encapsulates what I like about ancient Celtic society and the vaguely mystical elements regarding that society that existed from about 800 BC to the 1st century AD, after the birth of Christ. Existed, of course, most famously we know the word Celtic as referring to Scotland and Ireland, but those are sort of the last bastions of Celtic culture that was sort of wiped out by Roman colonization. And Celtic culture, extended into the far north of Italy and the Italian Alps. Sort of began in Switzerland in the 1200s and 1100s BC, vaguely. Austria, western and northern Poland, southern Germany. England and Wales, and most importantly for this game, in France. France was Gaul to the Romans. That was the Latin name, and it's this period of time that we'll be playing. Um, Although I won't get too far into what specific historical events are happening uh, in the background of this story, so as to not spoil. And, you know, even going through this slowly rotating main menu, it's really atmospheric. And the Celtic society had so many interesting aspects that lend itself to, you know, not only a sort of fantasy-based thing, and this game has just the right amount of fantasy elements to it. It has just the right amount of, you know, pagan druidic rites and, you know, that sort of thing. I mean, when you think about interesting aspects of the Celtic culture, of course the Druids come to mind, you know, the guy in the long white robe and the long beard is deeply in tune with nature. You know, you got stuff like the warrior that's on the screen now, all dressed in furs, you know, utterly, you know, in tune with his own sort of sense of self and freedom and masculinity, and in tune with the land around him. You know, the classic image of a northern barbarian war host emerging from the forest to attack their enemies. You know, the Celts had a specific style of dress that was interesting. They actually were very good at weaving lots of colorful cloths and different types of plaid, compared to a lot of the dreary brown and gray and peasant, you know, clothing of the Dark Ages and the later Middle Ages. And you think about how in England, in that particular part of the Celtic world, and in Scotland and Wales, I suppose, most famously in England, when Julius Caesar tried to conquer that area and then left it for the Emperor Claudius to do 100 years later, they would take the dye from berries and plants and paint it on themselves in intricate patterns that they thought would give them strength in battle. In another vein, let's when you think about the Germanic culture, which was in the northern section of Germany and eventually took hold in the rest of Germany and the modern German-speaking areas. You've got the archetype of the berserker, where we get the modern English term berserk, berserker. These warriors are generally depicted with some kind of wolf pelt or bear pelt, and what they would do was they would take some sort of drug, perhaps something to do with psychedelic mushrooms or some extreme form of alcohol or something, and they would whip themselves up into a frenzy and become impervious to pain, and they would be greatly feared. And most Germanic societies, both in this ancient period and in the later Viking period, have some concept of the berserker. One of the interesting elements that I think deserves to be talked about before we get into the game is Stonehenge. There's this trope in games and virtually any type of media focusing on any period of Celtic history where you just see like different Stonehenges just everywhere, like arrayed, and people think that that was basically like their way of building temples. Like every town had a Stonehenge in it, or every valley or hill, and in reality, Stonehenge was built like a couple thousand years before the Celts came to the place in southern England where you can go see it today. That's not to say that there aren't lots of other stone rock formations, that people have erected in ancient times, but they're basically all from before the Celtic time period, and they all had different meanings to the different people that erected them. There's lots of interesting ones in France and Scotland as well. So I thought it was important to mention that. And Celtic society had a lot of interesting progressive elements to the governmental structure. A lot of kings were elected. There were a lot of democratic assemblies, particularly in the case of the Aedui tribe, which controlled a fairly large portion of Gaul at one time. Remember, Gaul is ancient Celtic France. They gave a lot of rights to women as well, certainly a lot more than the Greeks and Romans did. There was the hill forts that were very common. It was sort of, you would create earthen mounds, and then you would have ditches around the mounds in different levels of earthen fortifications on top of each other, and then you would build wooden palisades around each level and have a nice fortified little town. Those are very sort of inherently aesthetic things to look at, especially when some historical reenactment society has actually put palisades on there. But unfortunately, all of this interesting stuff sort of fell by the wayside in our culture, and you don't really learn about it in school, even though for most of antiquity the Celtic world was Europe in a very real sense. Sure, there was no such thing as a Celtic empire, and it was all small warring tribes, and the Celts, spoke about maybe 6 languages off the top of my head, which is surprisingly few for such a wide variety of people. And they never really self-identified as being one great big ethnic group that we say today, Celts. Even though there's quite a lot of not only cultural similarity, but DNA similarity as well among different populations that we can trace back throughout the years. But this all sort of fell apart when Julius Caesar came into Gaul, and the far southeastern section of Gaul was already pretty well established as a Roman territory by that time. It's called Cisalpine Gaul. And actually the term Provence for that region of France in the southeast comes from the Latin word for province, because it was such an important province in the Roman Republic's military holdings at the time. But when Julius Caesar went into Transalpine Gaul, it all fell apart, and the Celtic military sort of strategy and the sort of wellspring of like tactical knowledge that they had was very, very simplistic. They probably had, a lot of them had even less armor than the axemen on the screen here. It was considered, for a particular sort of military order of Gaul at the time, it was considered very spiritually empowering to go into battle naked. And you just see naked people with the big helmet and large round shield with some curves in it to aesthetically improve that whole thing. And a huge ass sword, running into battle stark naked. But that was only some warriors. This was a group of people called the Gaisaitai in Gaulish, and most peasant warriors would be nevertheless shirtless. They'd be wearing pants and have a spear and a traditional very large shield, oval-shaped shield or rectangular-shaped shield. And not a lot of tactical finesse. It was really expected and understood, if you were a Celt, that you would kind of just charge randomly at the enemy. And in fact, when the Romans fought the Germanic tribes, which were in most ways even more technologically primitive than these Celts, that shaped our conception of what a barbarian warrior is. When they fought the Germans, the Romans were amazed that they actually fought in lines compared to what the Celts generally did. And so they had a lot of spears, also quite a lot of swords, and they really couldn't do anything against the highly trained Roman legionaries, such as it was at the time. Basically, how Roman military tactics work is you would have your very high quality armor, which changed in its layout for continuously throughout the centuries, but you would also have your very large rectangular shield called a scutum, S-C-U-T-U-M, and of course the gladius, the shorter than a short sword but larger than a knife, larger than a dagger, sort of a really huge knife that you would have, and take your scutum and you'd place your gladius directly out in front of you in the other hand, and you'd move in perfect formation with your comrades, and you'd stab, quick and fast, bum bum bum. And this was incredibly effective, and the Celtic tactics, such as they were at the time, couldn't really penetrate the wall of shields of the Romans. So the Romans didn't win every single battle against the Gaulish Celtic tribes, but the overwhelming majority of them. And it was only after a particular warlord called Vercingetorix, who's probably the most famous single ancient Celtic person, for the reason specifically that he was able to be the leader of the resistance of the Gauls for a little while before he was eventually defeated and captured and brought back to Rome in chains. I think the comics of Asterix and Obelix make some reference to Vercingetorix specifically. They're a French comic franchise set in ancient Gaul. Terribly historically inaccurate, but what are you gonna do? It's children's media. Most Americans don't even know what Asterix and Obelix is, and I personally don't even care to really get into that franchise at all. But yeah, there's a lot of interesting aspects that will show themselves in this game. There's aspects that this game doesn't include. There's lots of fantasy elements that are very well integrated. You know, a lot of the games that are my favorite are historical, but if they have some aspects of science fiction or especially fantasy, magic, I can really have an even stronger connection to them. And it's just really such an immersive, sort of calming experience to be wandering around in this world of not necessarily big mountains. That's more of a you know, Switzerland, Austria, Italy type of thing, or England, but you know, more rolling hills here in ancient Gaul. Little lakes and rivers, and you know, these beautiful villages made out of straw and wood, and wandering about, seeing all these little temples. It's truly one of my favorite games. It's actually, well, it was made in 2002, developed by a Bulgarian company, and made by published by a Spanish company. The original Bulgarian developer actually made Tropico 3 and 4, I think, alongside a couple of more obscure RTS titles. And this game got a lot more airtime in Italy and Spain specifically, compared to the US. It had different names in different countries. You can almost kind of tell that the developers never really expected it to get big, and of course, it never did get big. You know, but things like, you know, changing the name in different countries of the game because they didn't expect to have a big name franchise that people would recognize throughout the world. The fact that in English they didn't even bother to give the characters in the campaigns voice lines. They just kept, made some voice acting for the responses that the units make in you know, like every other RTS game. You know, you click on a soldier and he goes, "Yes, sir. Yes, right away. Marching, going out. Let's go." You know, so on and so forth. They didn't even make lines for the initial, you know, you click on them. that type of deal. They just made lines for when you order them to move. Um, Little things like that. The translation of this game from whichever language it was originally in, probably Spanish, um, because the Spanish and Italian versions have full voice acting for the characters. Um, the translation is pretty great. There's really nothing to complain about. A couple of tiny errors in the menus and the that sort of thing in the text that you can see in the when you mouse over the different buttons, but really very little to complain about there. And funny little aside, because there was 2 sequels made, both of which are mind-numbingly tedious and agonizingly frustrating, because, you know, they didn't really have the resources and the wherewithal to balance the game at all. And so it sort of got worse and worse, and by the 3rd game, it's basically unplayable. Even though the 3rd game is really interesting, they added like 6 new civilizations. In the first sequel, they added, let's see here, the Carthaginians and the ancient Iberian people, which have an interesting culture, if you want to read up on that. And in the 3rd game, they added the British Celts, the Germanic tribes, and the Egyptians, alongside the Iberians and the Carthaginians. I don't think any Greeks, but they did actually come out with a fully redone version of the 3rd game called Imperium 3: Great Battles of Rome. Imperium was the original Spanish title of this game. So I'll have to check that out eventually, because it is a great shame that Imperium 3 and 2 are basically unplayable. But yeah, there's a lot of interesting unique elements that I'll get into as we go along, and not a lot more to say. I hope you guys enjoy, and I did truly want to give some time to discussing who the Celts actually were, because most people don't really have any idea about, you know, my own personal favorite ancient civilization and the things that they have contributed to the world. Well, enough about that. Let's go.